Good morning. Bon matin et merci d'être ici avec nous aujourd'hui.
Good morning, and thank you for being with us here today. I'm Tyler McCann, Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Before starting the conversation today, I'd like to recognize that I am joining you from the west of Quebec, the traditional non-ceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. Today is the National Indigenous Peoples Day, and it enables us to recognize the culture and the history of the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit. Every learning of the people and the experiences of the Indigenous people is one step forward towards reconciliation.
As today's webinar highlights, Canada is complicated. Moving meat across provincial boundaries is one of a long list of things that are made more difficult by Canada's complex legal and governance systems. Those complexities are made more dynamic by the reality that Canada has no single agricultural system, but many diverse systems that can be built around regions, commodities, or markets. The federal, provincial, territorial agricultural policy framework was intended to tackle some of that complexity and dynamism and bring consistency and equity to how governments across the country support agriculture and food. However, as pressure on agriculture and food systems increase, so does pressures on that framework and on the broader governance of agriculture and food policy. As agriculture ministers look to sign their next 5-year agreement this July, the time is right to look at the future and consider whether existing policy processes and governance models can meet current challenges, including priorities like addressing climate change and securing food security. We are pleased that Dr. Grace Gogstad, one of today's panelists, will lead a distinguished fellowship project on this topic. The fellowship research will provide an up-to-date account of existing Canadian agri-food governance models, compare them to those in the EU, where a similar multi-level governance model can produce more meaningful changes of agriculture policy, and on the basis of that comparative exercise, propose alternative governance models to overcome the identified limitations of the current Canadian agri-food governance model. Dr. Skogstad's work will build on some of CAPI's recent work, including a report released last summer, written by Douglas Headley, a webinar held last fall, and a What We Heard report from December 2021. I would now like to introduce our moderator for today's webinar, Rory Mcalpine. Rory is a CAPI board member with decades of experience in government and industry. He recently retired as Senior Vice President, Government and Industry Relations after 15 years with Maple Leaf Foods. He previously served as BC's Deputy Minister of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries, and in the federal government, including many years at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Over to you, Rory.
Thank you, Tyler. Merci. C'est un plaisir de vous joindre de la Colombie-Britannique, and welcome everyone. I'm pleased to moderate today's webinar. In the first part of the webinar, we'll hear from CAPI Research Director, Al Mussel, who will be presenting the findings from an upcoming CAPI report on the barriers to interprovincial trade in red meat in Canada. Once Al has set the stage with his presentation, we'll have a discussion with our panel of experts. During the webinar, we ask that you please submit your questions using the Q&A box on your screen, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. So now I'd like to introduce the panelists before Al begins his presentation. So first, a word about Al. Al is Research Director at CAPI and Research Lead and Founder of Agri-Food Economic Systems. He was previously Research Associate at the George Morris Center, and his areas of research are farm management, agricultural systems, marketing, and agri-food policy. He holds degrees in agricultural economics from the University of Guelph, a doctorate in ag economics from the University of Minnesota, and he was a Fulbright Scholar. Next, I'm pleased to introduce to you Cam Prince. Cameron, who I've known for a few years, is Executive Vice President of Regulatory Affairs with the Atchison Group. He has over 35 years of experience in food regulatory programs and the food industry in both the US and Canada. And I got to know Cameron when he was Vice President of Operations at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. He specializes in food safety recall, crisis management, food systems under the Food Safety Modernization Act in the US, the GFSI, the Safe Food for Canadians Act, and so on. And next, as Tyler mentioned, we're very pleased to have Grace Gogstad. Grace grew up on a farm in northern Alberta, and this forged her lifelong interest in all things to do with agricultural politics and ag and food policy. Grace is a professor of political science at the University of Toronto, and her research examines how organized interests in the agri-food sector interact with the shared jurisdiction of Canada's federal and provincial governments. As Tyler mentioned, that very complex system that the industry operates in. And in addition to several journal articles, she's published 2 books on Canadian agricultural policy. And finally, we're very pleased to have a provincial perspective on this with the participation of Franco Naccarato. Franco is Executive Director at Meat and Poultry Ontario and founder of the Centre for Meat Innovation and Technology. For over 20 years, he's worked from field to fork in many different parts of the food sector with direct experience in retail, food service, and distribution. And he's worked with farmers through his work as supervisor, food service at Foodland Ontario, and manager of the Local Food Investment Fund and the Green Belt Foundation. So with that, we've got our panel set, and I'll turn it now to Al to give us his presentation.
Thanks very much, Rory. I'm just going to share my screen here if I can. All right, thanks very much. I'm going to go through a short presentation here based on some research for forthcoming CAPI report funded by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, completed along with my colleague Elizabeta Laika. I think Tyler made reference to this. For those of you that have been around Canadian agricultural policy for some period of time, you will know that the problems relating to interprovincial trade barriers in red meat are not new problems. They've been with us for quite some time. So with that in mind, you know, the purpose of our work in this area was to try and understand and dust off the structure of some of the issues in interprovincial red meat trade, to analyze some of the challenges and contributing barriers, but you know, I think there's a realistic sense that no one single report is going to solve all of these problems. It's really more of an attempt to try and scope the problem and identify prospective paths forward. Just to begin with a little bit of a market context, and again, our focus here is red meat. It's exclusive of poultry. So, you know, when you think about red meat, first of all, it should be acknowledged that on the beef and pork side, slaughter is dominated by federally inspected establishments. So going back to 2020, if memory serves me correctly, 94% of the primary cattle slaughter was in federally inspected establishments, and 96% of the pork slaughter was in federally inspected establishments. It is a very different situation for sheep and lamb, where 26% of sheep and lamb slaughter was in federally inspected establishments in 2020. We also have regional concentration, which is very different in beef, where we have concentration of production in Western Canada and significant surplus of beef production in Western Canada. We do have beef production in Eastern Canada, but much less so, and indeed Eastern Canada's net deficit in beef. Pork is much more distributed throughout Canada. Another dimension of it is that Canada is a very large exporter, net exporter of pork, among the largest. We are a net exporter of beef, but a much smaller net exporter of beef. The Canadian market is populated by large food service and retail organizations operating primarily at the national level. So to the extent that that interfaces with a primary production or processing segment that is fragmented, that's something that we take note of. With that acknowledged, we also have important and growing local and regional markets within provinces and regions that need to be served by whatever our regulatory and inspection system can provide it. As Tyler made reference to, the policy landscape in Canada is very complex. So many of you will be aware that agriculture is a joint responsibility of federal and provincial governments. It's almost unique, along with immigration, in that these are not overlapping jurisdictions. They are genuinely joint responsibilities. So both provincial and federal governments can make laws having to do with agriculture. That interfaces with a system in which there are federal jurisdictions that deal with commercial standards, regulations, criminal law, and the interpretation that that in agriculture and food, regulation by the federal government addresses international and interprovincial trade. Under Section 121 of the Constitution Act, it's been interpreted that provinces cannot raise tariffs against one another. However, there's nothing to stop provinces from setting differential technical standards that accomplish the same thing as a tariff would. There have been attempts to ease interprovincial trade barriers that relate to Section 121 and other elements through the Agreement on Internal Trade, and then most recently the Canadian Free Trade Agreement with its negative list approach and platform for harmonization. At the same time, we have regulatory standards, but we also have resources charged with inspection. And there is an interplay between the two of them. We can have strong regulatory standards, but of course, if we don't have the resources, the human resources to staff inspection, or we don't have the training resources to bring our inspection personnel up to a particular standard, the standards that we have will suffer. So there's an interplay there. Finally, Canada is obviously a trading nation, particularly in red meat, and we're bound by a range of trade obligations and international standards guidelines. GATT Article 3 is essentially a provision for equal treatment and requires that imported product not be treated at a disadvantage to domestic product. The WTO Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement essentially is the technical equivalent of GATT Article 3 in the sense that countries are not to treat imported product for the purposes of inspection or regulatory provisions as different from domestic product. And then finally, countries coalesce and establish equivalency agreements with one another based on the contents of Codex Alimentarius, which is a collection of technical standards for various aspects of the food chain that frame national regulation and equivalency agreements. So what does all this mean in terms of a dialogue in provincial and federal inspection? Well, first of all, Canada needs to have a national standard. We require imports to meet a national standard. So compliance with it's unclear how Canada could be compliant with GATT Article 3 or the SPS agreement without a solid national standard, which of course we do have. However, provincial standards, if they were perceived as being materially lower or lower in cost or more easily to comply with, could be perceived as a violation of GATT Article 3 or the SPS agreement. So we have to be very careful about how product that's under provincial inspection move outside the province. And of course, right now that doesn't occur. Some provincial establishments that serve a particular local or niche market within a province have no interest in moving to a federal standard. In other cases, Over time, that may have perhaps been the case at one point, but their customers have grown, et cetera. And today, they do have an interest in moving to a federal standard or being able to market outside the province that didn't previously exist. Provinces can use provincial standards as a means of protection against other provinces, as a barrier to trade, if they're inclined to do that. As we get into more outcome-based regulation, for example, under the Safe Food for Canadians Act, the interplay between standards and inspection resources could be enabling. So there is a potential path forward to this that I'll come back to again in a moment. We tried to come up with a good representation of how these things overlay on one another, and this is still sort of a little bit of a work in progress. The way to read this chart is you've got a horizontal axis at the bottom that deals with domestic issues. The vertical axis deals with international or trade policy issues. And as you get further along in either dimension, we're dealing with more and more of a national orientation. So dealing first with the horizontal axis here, you can see that the commercial provisions under Section 91 and the criminal provisions really push the system toward more of a national orientation. Section 95 and Section 121 tend to inhibit that. We have Codex that provides the technical standards that both national and provincial standards can be based upon and inspection resources interface into. Then on the vertical axis, you can see that GATT Article 3 and the SPS agreement tend to push countries towards more of a multilateral approach rather than a national one. So really the point of all this is when you try and overlay these things on one another, there is not a clean slate. In fact, we've got sort of a shaded area here, which I view as sort of the interface among them. It sort of highlights a fairly narrow path forward that deals with all these various overlaying aspects of governance that we have to be able to deal with. As part of our study, we went through the various aspects of provincial regulation, being very careful to not get bogged down in the technical standards. And for those of you who are familiar with it, a study like this could easily get swamped or drowned in the many various elements of technical elements of regulation. And we went through the various jurisdictions regulations using a basic sort of set of parameters set out in the columns here of this table. And then we attempted to vet them with provinces. And we get some very good responses from provinces. And by the way, we're still open if there's comments that people have on this table, because you get a sense of how much attention or how exactly this is interpreted by jurisdictions. It probably will influence how they respond to the provisions of the table. But perhaps the most important point, I guess, is the following. First, there is a dichotomy between federal and provincial inspection in the sense that you don't get commonality across rows between federal or any of the provinces. But maybe the bigger difference is among the provinces themselves. There isn't a single point of contrast that's between federal and provincial inspection. There's a great deal of variation among the provinces themselves. And that's an important point that I'll come back to. Another aspect of our work, we did a number of stakeholder interviews within the time frame that we had. And I think it's worth pointing out that certainly this should be probably interpreted as anecdotal. It's not representative because it's a relatively small slice. But it does give us, I think, a good sense of where the industry participants and jurisdictions are coming from in terms of understanding this issue. So we asked them, three fairly simple questions, and then sort of let the conversation go forward from that. What do you see as the benefits or advantages from moving to federal from provincial inspection? What are the costs or disadvantages? And what do you see as the stomach blocks or critical barriers? So, with each group with whom we spoke as we went through this, you could pretty quickly, people would tend to sort themselves out into camps. The first really focused on some frustration around provincial standards and inspection, as being seen as barriers to trade that are unnecessary and costly. And there was some view that for all practical purposes, these things are equivalent and really represent red tape that should be cut, just simple inefficiencies. A very different view also emerged from others, which looked at or drew upon the key differences between federal and provincial standards and the worry about the international optics of having two different sets of standards and how the expansion of provincial standards marketing outside the province could influence those perceptions, and some worry about that. Key advantages from moving to a provincial to a federal standard, some are pretty obvious: increased market access. There was a perception that moving from provincial to federal standard would be an enabling condition for retailer private standards. Now, I don't think that is strictly speaking correct. I don't think that that any of these private standards actually require federal standards, but I think this is more a matter of process and everything moving in the same direction. So that's why that perception existed. One respondent told us that they could not ship to a retailer distribution center as long as they were operating under provincial standard. They had to ship to individual stores, and that this changed when you go to federal standard. Others viewed as a benefit of going to federal standard difficulties in dealing with provincial inspectors in the directions that was taking. There are a number of difficulties and challenges moving to federal standard. Almost every respondent we spoke to, among the first things they mentioned were the fees, the cost share fees payable for federal inspection. Physical facilities were viewed as limiting for some, but that was not universal. In fact, some of the people with whom we spoke said they would be ready to move almost immediately, but the issue was actually inspection fees. When you move from provincial to federal inspection, it's a transition to a more competitive marketing environment, and some discussion that you could envision an increase in sales, but actually a decrease in margins, because you're now competing with larger organizations, a tougher market. When you move from provincial to federal standards, that has to map back the entire food chain. So if you're, for example, a standalone meat plant, if you were using provincial primary plants as suppliers, you now have to switch suppliers, and there's a premium in the market for that. And it would offer some challenges to multi-species plants. Key barriers: inspection fees, and some, strictly speaking, on the issue of federal standard, struggled with the cost benefit of covering those the cost of adoption, in particular the inspection fees. For some, there was an issue of footprint having to do with office spaces, et cetera, and the perceived clashes between the direction they'd been given as provincial plants versus the direction they would have to take as federal plants. Some discussion around a role for smaller plants, the idea that large plants serve the needs of large producers well, but smaller plants are there for the smaller producers, and it's a tough environment for smaller plants. Not a lot of new smaller plants being built, and a worry about the squeeze on the small producers. We didn't get a lot of clear solutions offered to the border town problem. Now I understand that there is some contemplation of pilots and some other things that may be in the works to address some of these border town problems, and maybe we'll get to that a little bit later in discussion. But just to sort of wrap up the discussion here, to the extent that there's frustration out there, and really the solution to this would be to just simply harmonize provincial and federal standards as a means of resolving this. That didn't seem to be a real option as far as we could see it, because it's going to require a federal sign off. There is a great variation between federal versus provincial, but also particularly among the provinces. And the optics of expanding subnational standards are always going to be awkward in international trade relations, and we have to recognize that. We did envision, however, a prospect of a pathway using equivalence, and equivalence on the template developed for us under the Canadian meat hygiene standards and the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, and that platform for harmonization. Now, our outcome basis is well established now in the Safe Food for Canadians Act and regulations. We do have a precedent for harmonization of provincial and federal standards for testing horticultural products that perhaps could be built upon. The federal inspection, the fees remain an issue. It's unclear to us how you would, perhaps you could exempt plants that wanted to make the change. However, if you did that, because these are material costs, there is some worry that you would upset the competitive balance between existing federal plants. So we would have to think through how that is done. Frankly, some provinces are going to be better positioned for their establishments to demonstrate equivalence with federal standards than others. So this kind of a change could create problems of inequity across provinces, and those would need to be sorted out. But if we can handle the issue, if we can address the issues of inequities, and anticipate whatever problems of provincial protectionism exist, we think there is a narrow path forward using the concept of equivalence on an establishment basis. Thanks very much, Rory. I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Al. You covered a lot of ground there in a short amount of time, and I think fully highlighted the complexity of the issues at play here. So I'm going to ask some questions of our panelists, and also keep an eye on the Q&A chat box to insert some questions that may come through. But let me start with Cameron Prince. Cameron, if I think back to the beginning of Al's presentation on those various factors that make it a complex set of issues, let me start with food safety. You are a food safety expert. I think, it's important to start with understanding what is the food safety risk that needs to be managed with respect to red meat. And in your experience, what is the context here? I think, both in terms of what the producer responsibility is, the regulatory role in helping to ensure safe meat. And then maybe you also want to talk a bit about then some of those other factors, including cross-border, because I know you work on both sides of the border, and the perspective of, this issue on both sides of the border might be helpful. So can I turn it to you?
Yes, thanks, Rory, and thanks to Cappy for setting up this webinar, a very important topic, one that's been around for a long time. And thanks for everybody that's participating in the extent of the interest in the topic. Yeah, this is really about food safety, and that's why we're having this discussion. So we can talk about trade and everything else, but at the end of the day, it really is about safe food. And the meat program has evolved historically over the last 100+ years to have a very, very robust, as compared to some other commodities, a very robust inspection system history. And the reason for that is that there are diseases that can be transmitted to humans via animals, warm-blooded animals in particular, and red meat in particular. And that goes back a long way to early diseases, which have long since been brought under control. But this meant that there was presence of a veterinary science was very, very important in the early days, and remains very important in meat inspection. So unlike other food commodities, there is a very strong veterinary science aspect to this. And another part of this whole story, of course, is animal welfare, humane slaughter. That is all critical to meat inspection. That's a little bit different from fruits and vegetables or other foods. So, and there are certain risks associated with meat. It's not to say that meat isn't by any means a risky food at all, but there are definitely issues like E. coli, salmonella, listeria which do exist in meat processing establishments, meat slaughter establishments. And we always have to be on guard for that. So really, that's the starting point, and that is what the basis for federal and provincial systems is, to prevent those food safety hazards. The industry cannot afford to have another E. coli incident, a Listeria incident. It is just a very damaging thing to the industry, not to mention, of course, the human implications, human safety implications, which are critically important, obviously. So that's the backdrop that we all have to think about, is food safety. And certainly there has not been many recent problems in the meat industry in Canada. It is quite regulated. It is very well recognized around the world as a very good system. And we have agreements with the US. In the case of red meat, it's with the US Department of Agriculture, Food Safety and Inspection Service. There is an extremely close working relationship between Canada, CFIA, and the USDA, FSIS. And this goes back many years. There have been irritants along the way with audits of each other and some adverse findings, but in general, the system works very well. And meat from Canada going to the US and vice versa is generally regarded as very, very safe and not many problems associated with it. But that is critically important, that trade. It's a critical importance of this whole question of interprovincial shipment of meat. As Al has described, we cannot have like a double standard. We don't want to be in a position where we end up having to recognize individual state systems, and they'd have to recognize provincial systems. It's much better to go by the federal system and allow the trade to flow freely. So yeah, that's, I'm trying to answer your question, Al. It's a big question. There's a lot of elements to it. I mean, Rory, but I'll turn it back to you. And if there's any supplementary questions, I'll pursue that. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Cam. Okay, now I'll turn to Grace. So Grace, now let's talk a little bit more about that regulatory fragmentation and the underlying government challenge in our federal country, our federal state of divided responsibilities, and then the interrelation to the international side of this that, as Cam highlights, is so important for trade. Is there a path, is there a compromise, or can you describe solutions even that might exist, or ideas to address this given the legal and governance context?
Thank you. Thanks very much. I appreciate being on this panel, and I very much appreciate joining Cappy as a fellow. So I think both Al and Cam have clearly laid out the issues. It is a very complex area. We know that. I do want to say from the start, though, that people often blame the shared jurisdiction for agriculture as a big problem here. And as Al has pointed out, the courts have well, he didn't mention the courts, but Section 91(2), which is trade and commerce, and Section 121, which is the economic union clause in the Constitution, are equally to blame or to be given credit here for this fragmented system, because the courts have divided jurisdiction over trade and commerce, such that the provinces, regulate within their borders, and Ottawa, Government of Canada, interprovincially and internationally. And as we know, the courts have really taken a very light hand, I think, compared to courts elsewhere in terms of what constitutes an economic union, allowing effectively non-tariff barriers between provinces. So I would say, I want to just get that out there, that it's not really all about the shared jurisdiction for agriculture as it is as much the interpretation of the trade and commerce power and Section 121. And as we know, the situation is different here in Canada as compared to in the US, where there is a very strong commerce clause for the government of the United States, so that if states want to trade interstate, they do need to meet federal standards. So that's not the case, as we know, in Canada. Now, so there are these underlying challenges, and obviously we've not had a success in the past in terms of trying to get intergovernmental agreement on how to harmonize national inspection standards. We've tried that, and we've not had success so far. But I do think, that there is reason to be optimistic now, because the situation has changed in some important respects. And I would just point out a couple of things, which Al has also mentioned. So bit of an echo chamber here, but hopefully not too much. So that under the Canada Free Trade Agreement, we do have these intergovernmental cooperation mechanisms now, reconciliation and cooperation tables, and the meat inspection standards are on that table, and there's a deadline there to try to get some agreement. I guess I would also remind everybody that, there has always been very good let's call it consultation and a fairly strong degree of cooperation in agriculture intergovernmentally. And I do think that the second thing that bodes well here then is not just that background of intergovernmental cooperation, but we've been through COVID. And what we've had to see through COVID is governments cooperating on some of these issues. And we did have a precedent during COVID in the Canadian Food Inspection Agency did agree with the provinces and the territories to make an exception if there were a food shortage or meat shortage, to make an exception to the requirement that all of the meat that's traded interprovincially would have to come out of a federally inspected establishment. And they did say that that they would allow provincially regulated establishments to trade interprovincially in order to prevent meat shortages. And I understand that never happened, but that I think was an important kind of, at least sort of de facto recognition that some of the provinces anyway must come fairly close to meeting the national standards, the standards for the federally regulated establishments. When I looked at the table that Al put up, and it's a really interesting table about how provinces the differences among provinces, which as he points out are more acute in many ways than between some of the provinces in Ottawa. I guess I was struck a little bit more by the extent to which a number of provinces do look like they aren't that far off the federal standards. And the one that did really seem to be standing out where provinces were lagging behind was around the having the preventative control plan in place. And I understand that is still it's probably going to be costly, and it's still a sort of fairly new standard, as I understand, not that many years old. So I do agree entirely that that there is an issue here, but I think what we would need to know a bit more is to what extent there are some provinces that are really coming very close to the national standards, and how many plants in some of these provinces really could be certified to national standards. Because I do think that the bottom line here is that there's going to have to be some recognition of equivalence across provinces if we have the provincially regulated plants that are essentially almost ready to be able to trade interprovincially. That would be obviously where one would start. And so I'd like to see a little bit more about that, about thinking about the number of those plants, where they're located, and it might then be possible to move on a kind of plant by plant basis, or even a province by province basis, that some of the provinces might be able to meet these standards. And where they can't, as Al points out, where the costs become prohibitive, there is going to have to be some kind of, I think, cost sharing here on the part of Ottawa to be able to make these plants to get them up to standards. So I do think it's a very delicate kind of a balancing act here, because we know that a lot of my suspicion is that a lot of producers are interested there are plants that are interested in doing this, but also we know that consumers also want to be able to buy locally. And so there may not be one size that fits all here. There may need to be, some kind of exceptions made, maybe some grandfather clauses for some of the plants that are not ever going to rise to not ever going to be able to afford the costs of meeting the federal standards. So I'm just going to leave it there. I think there are economic issues here. Obviously, there's some provincial issues around having facilities that are not so remote from producers, and this is kind of complicated, but I don't see it as irreconcilable, because there is, I think it's on the agenda. When things are on the agenda, I always think that's a good thing, and that there is this platform of cooperation and coordination. So without ever being at any table here, I'm kind of optimistic that something could come out of this. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Grace. Thank you very much for that overview. Okay, well, look, let's now turn to the provincial perspective here. Franco, you're representing the provincial system and establishments in Ontario. And we've heard a bit of a note of optimism there from Grace. I'm wondering how you react to that. And let me maybe start first. I recall back in 2011, there was a federal pilot program that offered the opportunity for provincial plants to be assessed and evaluated for the opportunity to become federally licensed, and money was made available for those efforts. But if I understand, in the end, there were 13 or 15 plants nationally that were part of the pilot, but none of them ultimately were able to get over that hurdle. And I wonder if, from your experience, what are the issues in getting those provincially licensed and inspected plants? And maybe the final piece is like Ontario's got a very advanced system of regulating the meat sector and a good track record. But as you look at it, how do you view the other provinces that maybe aren't as far along? And, you probably have frustrations with the federal side of this, but you may have frustrations with some of the other provinces. And I'm just wondering how you look at the situation from where you sit.
Sure. And I think part of the frustration is the length of time it's taking to get to this. We've been talking about it for 25 years. And really, the solutions coming forward have been limited. And you talk about that pilot project. That pilot project was all about exploring opportunities for interprovincial trade. And then, the answer that was given was, well, just become federal. And that's not the answer that provincial plants were looking for. And I talked to two of the plants that did do that pilot. One of them did become federal, and the other one chose not to because there was limiting factors like having a retail establishment as part of their facilities. They weren't allowed to retail out of the same facility. And 70% of our members have a retail component. So that's a huge limiting factor at the time when it was very prescriptive. Now, Safe Food for Canadians Act has changed. There's optimism. There's opportunity. The government's saying, yes, we're outcome focused now. And I think if everyone could think about outcome focus, that's the thing that's going to unite us all. And, Corey, you mentioned about differences. Well, I'm not sure what those differences are because things have changed quite drastically in the landscape of the last few years. One of the things I recall reading was the Justice Haynes report that really looked at why there's two systems. And he had an in-depth conversation. And he says the difference is in size and scope, not safety. Where he was adamant that the two systems exist because of size and scope, because of the issues we're talking about, cost, efficiencies. You need two scaled systems to help the different size businesses. And my view is, how do we help accelerate the growth of the businesses? And Rory, I heard you say in a previous things, we need more growth in the sector. We need to grow our number of meat businesses. And why aren't we growing them? Well, there's a glass ceiling, and there's a lot of frustration with businesses today who have customers in other provinces that they could be doing business with, but can't because of a reason or another. And I think what the frustration is, everybody's trying to get everybody to do the same thing, when there's, as you point out, Roy, very different programs in Ontario than there is in Saskatchewan, but there's differences for a reason. And I think we got to stop thinking about how do we get everyone to be equal, and then instead think about what is a level that everyone could agree to is the right checks and balances in place. Because I think we all have the right food safety, but it's the checks and balances that we need to make sure that are equal across the board. And third-party audited systems, I think, provide that, whether it's a GFSI program or a HACCP program. That's the missing link that we think, and I think the province of Ontario has some great ideas, and how to explore this further. And their idea is a sandbox approach where you could practice this and look at it under a regulatory scope while it's happening. Let's stop talking about it. Let's get a pilot project closed in nature, 3, 4, 5, 6 participants through a duration of time. And let's see what are the gaps in the things. We don't want to see people gaming the system. We don't want to see shortcuts through the system. We want to see this strengthening our food safety programs across the country. And, we're much better together working collaboratively as a nation than we are as individuals and individual provinces on private agendas. We need to start working collaboratively. If we want to grow the sector, that's the approach we need to be taking.
Yeah. Well, that's great, Franco. Thank you for that very constructive point of view. On that issue of, if you will, a sandbox kind of approach to equivalence or common standards, I recall that back pre-COVID, CFIA came up with a bit of a guide to how they might adjust regulatory oversight, i.e. moderate it, for companies that are compliant to GFSI benchmark standards. And that was kind of, a recognition. Those are really important. And we know they're very important to the retailers. Many of the major retail groups now are demanding compliance to such standards down through their supply chains. Do you see that then? Are you suggesting that we put in a sandbox kind of any operator that is GFSI compliant and see if that could be the basis then to change the regulatory oversight and permit interprovincial trade?
Yeah, I think that could be a solution, Rory. I mean, the CIS model in the US is another model. There's probably 3 or 4 or 5 different types of solutions. And that's why I think the sandbox approach is best. I don't have the solution. I can't tell you what's going to work best for Canada. I could see what could work for individual businesses. And I think the sandbox approach could do process of elimination, test the different theories out and see which one's going to work best for the whole sector. And, and assess what's going to work in Ontario, what's going to work in Saskatchewan, and looking at, and everybody working together towards finding out, what's going to work best for this nation. And I don't think it's a one size fit all. Al, I think that's one of the points of your report says we can't have a one size fits all approach to this. We really need to think about the uniqueness of the different parts of the country and how do we help those areas, and focusing on what the retailer requirements are and what the buyer requirements are is one way of doing that. Yeah,
for sure. Well, look, we've got a question in from Jorge Correa at the Canadian Meat Council. He references the CIS, the interstate program that came in the US with the 2008 Farm Bill. And I believe, according to Jorge, there's now 10 states that are participating in that. Now, Al, maybe you can comment. I think you looked a little bit at that. Like, how does that interstate model work? Is it working in the US? And I'll also perhaps come back to Cameron as well, because Cam, you work on both sides of the border. How is it working? But also, how is it being perceived? Like, are there trade partners of the US that, the US exports meat all over the world? Are some of their, including to Canada, like, are other countries concerned about lower standards or something in terms of interstate movement of meat in the US? And is that, have they solved that internationally? So, Al, do you want to comment on the interstate program in the US?
Sure, Rory. I'll comment briefly. I will defer a little bit first to some colleagues, Hélène Netto and others that commissioned that did a similar study commissioned by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada to this study, in which they focused on precisely that. Remy Lambert was another one of the authors. And I may defer here a little bit to Cam, but yeah, it's expanded to 10 states. That sounds right. Some provision, I believe, unutilized, as far as I know, that the U.S. could export from those plants. I mean export internationally, not just across states. My initial thought on this was that because of where we have been in terms of the rigidity between federal and provincial standards, that equivalence did not really offer a lot to us. But I think we're presented, through the through the meat hygiene standards, I think we're presented with a pathway now that we've got something somewhat independent, or at least it's not in legislation or regulation, that we can appeal to as a basis for equivalence. And that with that in mind, maybe the CIS model could present a type of a path forward to us. But I think I should defer to Cam here, who may have some more tangible experience with it.
Cameron?
Yeah, I've got a few comments on that. I don't pretend to be an expert in CIS by any means, but we do encounter that in our practice fairly often. We have some clients who are actually in this space of actually building new plants under that program. So they would be states licensed or registered under the CIS program. And it's interesting that the economics are such that they feel they can be successful, these new plants under this system, and it is working fairly well. I would say that one thing we have to consider here is that the level of standards is fairly high in these CIS state plants. It is very, very close to the federal level. And so there is a fair bit of expenditure and compliance work that has to be done. Food safety programs, food safety plans, all of those are front and center in these CIS plants. So that's been our experience. As far as the international trade, certainly there's interstate trade or is permitted. And I have heard, as Al has, that there is some export from these facilities as well. Now, maybe Jorge, who's asked the question, would maybe know more than I do on that aspect of it. But certainly, yeah, I firmly believe this is a model that we should be looking at. There's certainly some lessons learned from CIS for the Canadian context. Keep in mind that it is mainly a Western US, and it's kind of a politically, it's producer-driven agenda on these things. So that's the genesis of it, at least in the US.
Yeah. Maybe Cam has used the word politically. There's definitely politics around this whole topic, right? Because clearly provincial ministers and leaders want to see their sectors in their provinces succeed, create employment. I think there's also a factor here where, as we've seen in COVID, when you're dependent on a few large national plants and things go wrong in those plants, there can be significant consequences. I mean, I say that as a former employee of Maple Leaf Foods, which had a terrible food safety crisis that had major national ramifications in terms of death and illness, simply because the volume of product going nationally out of that plant was significant. We've seen too how, in the case of COVID, where the COVID illnesses in some of the large facilities has caused them to shut or to be closed for weeks at a time. And so the whole meat supply was vulnerable. And that led actually to the exemption for interprovincial trade that Grace referred to. But Grace, in the realm, I guess, of politics, you've described kind of the legal and the governance. Is the path forward, is there a political path forward? Like, would you, for example, say that something actually built into the new federal provincial framework for agriculture is something to do? Or is there something in other sectors of our economy where we can reconcile the political interests here to advance a solution?
Okay, well, in terms of political, okay, I'm off mute, am I okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, I mean, I do agree entirely with you, Rory, that the context has really changed here with respect to issues around food safety. What seems to be kind of coming together is both food safety and food security. And we see this kind of coherence owing to COVID, right? In the sense that people are now thinking a whole lot more about resilient food supply systems. And for many people, resilient food supply systems mean not being dependent upon imports to the same extent that we've been, or as you pointed out, not having so much of the slaughter and the meat processing taking place in just a handful of plants. So I think that there is this kind of mental shift that's going on in the sense that public opinion, political attitudes around food safety, around food security. Of course, there's been the animal welfare dimension as well that's been added. That this is the kind of context in which, you know, to the extent that public opinion matters to governments, I do think that this is the context that some of them are dealing with as well. There is, of course, you know, as you point out, you know, the economic component here, which plays into politics, because no politician ever wants to be responsible for job losses, that's for sure. And so that's always going to be a dimension here. But I think the politics around this are only going to get more complicated because of these issues that I've said, that they're overlapping issues of food supply and food security and animal welfare. But I do think as well that that, you know, what I'm not sure about the framework agreements, Rory. They seem to be agreements that are based on general principles, and then we have bilateral agreements essentially for each province. There, that may be the mechanism because that bilateralism is there. You know, as I say, I'm not at any of these tables, so I'm not exactly sure about what is exactly the best format. But I really do agree with Franco, which is that, you know, that you have to be able to think creatively about this, and that, you know, the Canadian federal system basically functions because there is that kind of leeway within it for provinces and Ottawa to do things slightly differently in one province as compared to another. We've seen this with you know, most recently with the childcare framework, right? That a bunch of bilaterals, every province kind of, you know, figures it out somewhat differently. We know Quebec has long had a very asymmetrical relationship in the federation. So I'm for these kind of tailored kind of approaches, as long as we can avoid the problem that Alan has pointed to, that if you get too much heterogeneity inside of the country in terms of, you know, what the standards are, then you do probably face a trade complaint.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, maybe we can go further back to Franco. And John Ross has raised a good question. Of course, we focus on the challenge of meeting the regulatory requirement, and that example of the being unable to operate a retail establishment on site. I wasn't aware of that. That really does sound quite extraordinary. And I do wonder whether under the Safe Food Canadians regulations now in force, which are intended to be more outcome oriented, although most of the provisions are just a replication of what was in the previous meat inspection regulations. But I wonder, would that still be prohibited under that? But I guess what I'm wondering, or John is wondering, is, you know, what are the issues? What are the economic issues? Because it's not only that there's a regulatory context and inspection fees if you want to be federally registered. I'm sure there's some major economic challenges to expanding and to being viable commercially for a provincial plant, particularly a multi-species plant, right? That I think some of them are, or several of them are. So do you want to comment more on some of those operational challenges and whether there's a context here that goes beyond just the regulatory that we need to be mindful of?
Yeah, and I'm not a technical guy, so I can't get into all the technical things. I could share anecdotal what I've heard from plants and why they've had difficulties. So I'll give you an example. One plant in particular just rebuilt a new facility, and they built it to federal standards, they thought. And they were fine on the fresh side, but when they got to the further process side, they ran out of space, and they produce a lot of products, and they're constantly turning things over. They produce probably 50 or 60 different products. And the federal system isn't really built for that type of versatility in operations. And so it made it very difficult for them to navigate the requirements of the federal system. So they ended up having a provincial further process plant and a federal primary processing plant. And the funny thing about the regulations was the federal system made them put up permanent walls between the two facilities, and they actually have to ship products from one building around to the other building. And that makes no sense. That outcome is not a food safe outcome, right? That's the bad thing, what you want. So even though we have food safe outcomes through Safe Food for Canadians, there's still a culture of change that needs to happen in both systems. And I think we need to get our provincial systems outcome focused as well. And OMAFRA has been really good at looking at opportunities to transition and follow the line of CFIA and aligning with CFIA whenever possible. And that's what we need to be doing more of. And one of our projects we're working on is on the Center for Food Innovation and Technology. And we want to work with regulating bodies to look at how do we get better alignment? How do we get better synergies between the federal and provincial systems? How do we train inspectors similarly so that we are achieving the same outcomes? It doesn't matter if you're provincial or federal, let's make sure everybody's achieving the same outcomes. And if we focus on that, I think that's going to be a healthy environment for all of Canada. And I think we're there. I think it's how do we start weeding out the small differences between federal and provincial and work on enhancing them.
Mm-hmm. Just to clarify, Franco, in the inspection, licensing and inspection in Ontario, we've talked about the cost of federal, but just can you clarify in Ontario, what is there a requirement for full-time inspection presence both in a slaughter establishment and a further processing establishment? And what are the costs? I believe Ontario does charge some fees, and maybe it's just the overtime fees or whatever. Can you characterize what that looks like?
Sure, yeah. In abattoirs, there's full-time inspection inspection staff have to be on site at all times. And then the size and scope will determine how many people you need, similarly to the federal system. And on the processing side, it's a risk-based assessment based on the level of activity that you're doing, and that would determine the frequency of inspection at that time. There for basic inspection, there's no fees, but on as you mentioned, overtime, there would be requirements for payment on those.
Right, and animal welfare is part of that. I'm sure in the slaughter ante-mortem inspection, there's a whole element of managing animal welfare.
Yeah, and it's it's a huge focus for the Ontario government, and we work quite regularly with the vets, and they have a great unit there that's dedicated to ensuring animal welfare and safety, and they do pre-inspection and post-inspections throughout the entire time. Great,
okay. I'm just looking at some questions here. Some of them are quite lengthy. Maybe I'll ask you. Maybe I'll ask this one, and again, maybe I'll go to Al, but then perhaps to Cameron. The U.S. Wholesome Meat Act of 1967 required that states have inspection programs equal to that of the federal government. So states are already starting from a different point of view in terms of embarking on that interstate shipment program. That seems to be quite important because that is not a legal or regulatory reality in place in Canada. Back to that provincial diversity problem. Al, can you comment any more about the provincial diversity, if you will? And I don't know, even, the fact is there have been some significant crises events of contaminated meats, both in provincial and federal, but is there a context there at the provincial level, or what more can you tell us about the diversity of standards and operations at the provincial level?
Yeah, sure. First, let me take on the point in the U.S. and I'm not sure I have much to answer on the question other than to say, it's this is true of U.S. agricultural regulation in general. For the most part, what states do is they administer federal regulations. So it's kind of it's when I started looking at this CIS model, I was a little bit confused because they got to be near federal anyway. So how much is really being gained here? And I think one of the elements that perhaps others could comment on if they feel it's important is that I think the plants that can apply to it, there's a cap on 25 employees. So they're going to be pretty small plants that are involved in the CIS program. Yeah, turning to provinces, in my understanding of it, we do have a great variation across provinces in Canada. We've got, as was mentioned, some provinces that are probably near federal in important aspects of it, and others that, you know, whether it's a lack of resources or for whatever legacy reasons, you know, you regulate plants almost a little bit more like you would restaurants, you know, using public health authority resources or what have you. And you know, I would worry that in some of those situations, in some provinces, and certainly for some establishments within provinces, an equivalence model will be difficult for them, and you know, maybe even insurmountable, versus other provinces and other establishments which actually could be very well positioned to operate in an equivalence standard manner. And that gets back to this issue of how you deal with potential inequities across provinces and across establishments and in the competitive dynamic. The other aspect here that I don't want to lose sight of, because a few of the other panelists have raised it, is inspection resources and the resources to train inspectors. I wish we had that information. I think it probably seems to take some work to collect this, but if we knew, you know, sort of the resources within the Canadian Food Inspection Agency in terms of professional standards and the number of them relative to provinces, I think that might help us sort that issue out a little bit.
Okay,
If I may jump in there, one of the outcomes of COVID was that CFIA and the provinces came to an agreement of being able to cross-train their professionals for the sole purpose of backing each other up when there's shortages on inspection. So that's one of the good things to that last point, Al, is you now have federal inspectors that are learning about provincial inspection, and you have provincial inspectors learning about the federal system. And that's something we need to continue building on. The more we could do that, the more alignment we could continue building between the federal and provincial systems. And these are the types of solutions that we need to be working on, right? Is how do we find ways of bringing these two systems through training, through regular communication, through you know, aligned policy development. These are the types of things in the future that are going to make it easier to bring all these provinces together.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's been a good reason to jump over then to Cam. Cam, I don't know if you want it, you've got thoughts right now, but if you were VP of operations for CFIA, you had to deal with these resource challenges. And if I recall, like there were some provinces that were paying CFIA to operate the inspection services in provincial plants. I'm not sure if any provinces still contract the CFIA to do that now. But then if I recall, CFIA disengaged in, I think, one or two examples, again, maybe for cost reasons or operational reasons to concentrate on their federal responsibilities. But can you comment on your experience in that?
Yeah, and it's funny you raised that, Roy, because I was going to jump in and say what's old maybe new again, in that there were very strong resources in provinces, several provinces, BC, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, had essentially CFIA provided inspection services, much like the RCMP does policing in some provinces, and that was paid for. And the climate back at the time was that CFIA was trying to consolidate resources. They had resource challenges. I was there as VP of Ops, and it was hard to get enough staff out to all of the meat plants that we had. And so the tendency then was to shrink it back from that provincial responsibility. And provinces were kind of, for various reasons, were thinking they might as well get out of it as well. So there was an evolution over a few years in the late 2007, 8, 9, away from that model. But it's interesting because at the same time, there were voices on this issue that were saying, well, why don't we just fund this properly and have a federal CFIA could provide meat inspection across the country. Now, it would be to the individual provinces' requirements, but it would be a much more cohesive system. Now, that is still something that, you know, I mean, maybe it's pie in the sky, but something to think about, at least in this whole discussion. It's expensive. no question, because that it would require the hiring of a lot of inspectors and veterinarians, but it could be done. And I know back at the time, there was some discussion with central agencies in government about doing that. The price tag was a bit too steep at the time, but anyway, it's interesting that may be part of the solution, because part of the problem here is money for inspection resources in some places. So yeah, it's worth exploring anyway.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we toss out a thought here. I've got a question from Kathleen Gibson. Kathleen, like myself, is in British Columbia, and I know Kathleen was quite involved in the modernization and the changes to provincial meat inspection in BC. BC, of course, has some unique challenges just given the geography and the diversity of ecosystems and the mountainous terrain and isolated communities that are challenged to sustain food security and protein given that. And in the case of the changes in BC, there was a graduated licensing system. So, we tend to talk about federal versus provincial as a binary issue. Well, in BC, there's different types of licenses for different types of operations. And maybe the idea could be that you work out equivalents for those plants that meet a higher licensing standard provincially, but don't try to implicate the plants that are operating on a much smaller scale in a remote region where their operation is important for the local food supply. I don't know, Grace, do you want to comment on any of these other solutions? And I think previously we were talking about healthcare. I mean, healthcare is an example where federal funding goes to provinces, but it's on the basis of meeting certain outcomes and standards. Are there examples here that you want to draw to our attention?
No, thanks. So yeah, healthcare, we all know the 5 principles for the federal government cost sharing of healthcare. And so one could envision something like that it would have to, meet certain standards. I'm not exactly sure how you would translate that, but I do think that just what you just proposed, Rory, is that a solution here would be one that didn't try to cover every slaughter plant or every meat processing plant, because as has been pointed out, you can't. In certain areas, in certain countries, certain parts of a province, it may just be a local plant that's just going to serve a local community. And why should ultimately it's going to have to be responsible, publicly accountable to the consumers there and the local governments to make sure that the food is safe. But I don't understand. I agree that there's no reason why you would have to think about a plant like that conforming to standards that were required for interprovincial trade or for international trade. There's the argument that's been made before is that there's no single solution here is probably a good argument here. Not sure if that gets at what you were asking, Rory, but I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Well, again, on that question of other countries, Al, I don't know if you looked at Australia. There again, a federated state. Do you know anything about what they do? And even in the European Union, of course, you have state systems that were amalgamated. And I know from my history that, even Canada over the years has had a number of concerns about the standards of safety and inspection in some of the plants in Southern Europe versus Northern Europe. And on that basis, should we be importing product from the EU uniformly when those standards may not be consistent? Al, do you comment anything more about the international context from your research?
Yeah, really only limited, Rory. Again, I think I need to defer to Hélène Metho and Remy Lambert's work on this. It was commissioned at the same time that our study was commissioned. It's very good looking at subnational regulation in Australia and also in the US under the CIS system.
Okay.
But I think more generally, it would be nice to know, just how many countries in the world do have subnational systems, particularly our competitors. I don't know whether we have subnational systems in, for example, Brazil or Argentina or South Africa, or even I assume probably there is in EU states, but I don't know that much about it. The second thing about it is, well, really three things, but the second thing is, do they charge for inspection the same way that we do? Now, this is a little bit of a complicated question. So typically people will say, well, provincial inspection is free and federal inspection isn't. Well, there's some caveats around that. If you want to run a Saturday shift or overtime, then provincial inspection probably isn't free then. And I understand that if you go and compare Canada and the US, so on the surface, the USDA inspection is free, except it isn't if you want to run a Saturday or overtime or certain export type certifications, they're going to charge for that. But wouldn't it be interesting to know among our major competitors how all of that is done? And I guess the third thing is what resources they really have to back it. Now, to some extent, when we do, when we have our equivalency agreements with trading partners, I assume, having never been involved in it, I assume that a major part of that is, how much resource do they really have to bring on the inspection side, and that's evaluated at a point in time. But it would be nice to know, like what resources do they really have for implementation, and how does that factor in? Those are all unknowns, and maybe there's more of a literature there than I'm giving credit to, but personally, I'd like to know all this because I think it all factors into this issue.
Yeah, for sure. We're starting to approach the end here, and I do have a single question I'm going to ask each of you around future paths to success, paths to resolve this. But before I get to that, maybe I can come back to you, Cam, again, back to the food safety question. And I'm curious to know what you would say needs to be top of mind. And I say that because there's a mantra in the world of food safety that says you can't inspect your way to food safety. Right. And of course, and the public, of course, doesn't necessarily understand that. And the whole question of how to sustain, sorry, just turn off my phone here, how to sustain consumer trust is really important, right? And the perception would be that just more inspection will ensure safe food. What do we need to keep in mind to overcome that? And I'll be honest about the issue. Again, I speak as a former employee of Maple Leaf Foods, where this issue of listeria. So in meat processing plants, now in Canada, you've always had to have, but now it's more robust than ever, mandatory product testing and environmental testing for the presence of listeria. I don't believe that's the case in any provincially inspected plant anywhere in Canada. And we know the consequences that can occur. What would you say we need to keep in mind as we approach this in terms of that balance between the operator's responsibility, the regulatory responsibility, and in turn, how do you sustain consumer trust?
Yeah, great question, and some complicated answers to that. I really think it's important that, well, obviously we have to maintain consumer trust. But you're right, consumers think more inspection means safer food, and that is just simply not true. It really is about food safety systems. And the whole world is going that way when we look at the US and the food safety modernization, Safe Food for Canadians. What it's really all about is accountability of producers to produce safe food. And the whole concept of food safety culture is really coming to prominence around the world. It's really about having the food safety top of mind in all of these processing establishments. And really the ideal place to be is way ahead of the regulators, to be state of the art, thinking about food safety all the time, identifying problems, encouraging people to speak up and say something within facilities to make sure that any problems are identified and corrected quickly. So the whole world is moving in that direction of food safety culture and industry responsibility. And in many cases, companies are way past what the concept of what regulators have put in place. And the regulators are actually, we were catching up in terms of bringing in preventive control plans in Canada and in the US. And so I think ultimately the answer is for companies to take responsibility, big, small, all sizes. And the regulatory framework now in Canada really encourages that. I think we do have, though, a challenge with consumer understanding of this whole system. And I really think better communication around safe food and how we get safe food and what goes into it, and the whole concept of supply chains and risk, and having robust food safety systems. And that doesn't necessarily mean more inspectors. It doesn't, you know, in the case of meat, though, we do have to look at the humane slaughter aspect, and that requires veterinary presence. I don't think we're going to get away from that. But certainly better consumer understanding of where safe food has to come from, I think it is a really important starting point in all of this. So I'll leave it at that, Rory, and talk about that for a long time.
Yeah, for sure. So that cultural thing. Well, look, let's then just go around here to finish up. So my question is this to each of you. Imagine a clean slate. Well, when I say clean slate, I mean, we have to recognize we live in a federal system. We've got a constitution that does divide responsibilities, or clearly with the trade and commerce powers. Although when it comes to criminal powers, so the Federal Food and Drugs Act is based on criminal statutes. So it applies regardless of what the food is, where it's sold, whether it's imported or produced under a provincial regime or nationally. That aspect of it is regulated differently, or the standards are set under criminal powers. But if we take a clean slate view, maybe starting with you, Al, you know, can you see a path here? Your first path forward is to get your paper out. I know that's the key, and that's going to be really interesting for all of us to read. But are there things that are emerging in your mind, literally perhaps over the next year or two, that you think we should get focused on to try to resolve these issues, while, of course, as Cam so well emphasizes, maintaining a safe meat supply?
Yeah, you know, on that, I just want to build for a moment off of some of Cam's comments. You know, when we get into the issue of inspection and standards, it's very reasonable that your starting point is public health, and clearly that's an important part of it. But you know, one of the other questions that's related to this came up in the chat is, well, you know, what about competition among firms and how that collects information and so on? To me, you know, our standards are a guarantor of public health, but they also establish a category, a product category, within which companies can build a business model and compete with one another. So I think part of what we're trying to do here is have a realistic trade-off that builds a sustainable product category that meets all the public health standards and needs for it, et cetera. But also doesn't go so far that, you know, you've got only a very small slice of companies that actually can participate in developing the category because you've overreached in a particular way. You know, I think this idea of equivalence that we've talked about extensively, I think is a really important path forward, and you know how that ends up manifesting itself. You know, you can immediately get bogged down in all the technical issues of, well, you know, are the provincial inspectors going to inspect at federal standards, the federal inspectors at provincial standards? Like, how's all that going to work? Or, you know, let's let that play out. But if we can start a path forward using this idea of equivalence and giving it some legs, and I guess the last part of it is, you know, I like Cam's analogy to, you know, the RCMP provides policing services in a whole range of provinces. So what that means is you've got some uniformity across provinces in terms of the policing resources that are there. in my understanding of it, and I would really like to see all the data, the information and so on inspection resources across provinces. I don't think we have that uniformity today. And I think that'll be an important part of moving forward.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Al. Grace, what is your ideal path forward here?
Well, I mean, I think that Canada has got quite a few things right. So if we're starting from what we've got right, I think that, you know, I make a distinction essentially between risk assessment and risk management. And the risk assessment part is essentially about making sure that you're not putting an unsafe food on the market, right? We saw what happened in the European Union when they had the BSE crisis, and they lost complete faith in the then, you know, certification of products to come on the market. So, you know, it was hugely damaging to the EU. It resulted in an institutional change. We know all that. So there, you know, the main thing is to make sure that people can keep confidence in the system. So we're starting from a good system, a good starting point here. I do think, though, that we just need a little, like, I need more information about the magnitude of the problem. I mean, we've heard various people online say that, you know, maybe it's the scale of the problem is not all that big. Maybe it's more manageable than it might appear to be to somebody who didn't really have the kind of knowledge around exactly what number of plants and that sort of thing we're talking about. So, but I mean, I also take enormous encouragement from the fact that we have a system here where people are talking to one another. They can disagree for years on ends, it seems, but the fact that, you know, they've been working together on this issue. Various people have pointed to the context having dramatically changed, that there is a bit more urgency around this, a bit more willingness to work together. So I would just say, you know, kind of keep on doing what you're doing, and hopefully then we'll get to some kind of flexible system that still allows us to, you know, we have to, I think that Al's right. We have to maintain the national treatment principle. We can't treat imported product differently than we treat national domestic product. But equivalence doesn't have to mean harmonization. I mean, you recognize another system is essentially identical, or it results in the same kind of output as what you've got, right? And so we shouldn't be thinking about harmonizing. We do need to be thinking about equivalence, so sort of mutual recognition of standards that come close enough to one province's or the federal government to be recognized essentially as equivalent.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Grace. Franco, over to you. You mentioned at the beginning, we've been talking about this for 25 years. Is there a path to, you know, not continue in that, I guess, fruitless discussion, but at the same time, recognize, you know, I represented a federally inspected facility, and of course we were concerned and we wanted to maintain the integrity of the system and the confidence of our trade partners, most importantly, given the export dependence. I'm wondering how you see it. And maybe here's the specific question. We all know governments will react to their stakeholders, but if there was some sort of alignment, like within Ontario, have the provincial plants and the federal talked about this? Like, is there any compromise in an industry to industry dialogue that could frame something that would be a path on this? Or are we deflecting to government to solve this when maybe there's something to be discussed between the industry, and then bring that forward as some kind of a path forward?
And I'm sure you could attest to this. Sometimes we're our own worst enemies, Rory, and we don't talk enough about these things. And I think this is the best question that you've asked. And I think we could do a whole webinar just on this one question. And if we wanted to reimagine where we are, and we start with a clean slate, I think the first thing we need to do is work on what Cameron said, which is creating a culture of food safety. And that happens through training. And we don't have a strong enough training regimen in Canada like they do in other parts of the world. I was just in Germany and I was talking to them, and you have to be a master butcher in order to operate a food processing facility. So that's a huge difference than what's required here. How do we build that culture? And I think we have a good culture in Canada, but how do we be world leaders is where we need to be doing. This is what the whole Center for Meat Innovation and Technology is all about, is how do we stop thinking about meeting minimum requirements and how do we start being world leaders? And if we can think about being world leaders every day, then that's going to create the culture of change that we need to. And with our government, we need to form partnerships. And we've done that in Ontario. In fact, the minister created the Meat Industry Engagement Panel, which is all about involving the industry in policy development. And so we could have dialogues before policy happens. We could have dialogues about current policies and bring up issues and solve them. And we've done that with a number of policies already. And it's been a great success and partnership with the province on improving food safety outcomes while getting industry input into processes. And I think that's a great model looking forward. If we were to rebuild it, everyone should have that mechanism going forward.
Great.
And we
Thanks,
need
Rick.
people at the end of the day. And that's, you know, we could talk about that another time, but having good people, it's all about that.
Good. Cam, any final words of wisdom from your experience, both within government and now outside of government, that we should bear in mind as we go forward with that clean slate kind of attitude?
Yeah, I really like the question about clean slate, and the clean slate for me, or the way forward, I think, is going back to discussions that took place 10 to 15 years ago around the meat code, and provinces got together, and there was actually some excellent dialogue at the time and good cooperation, good spirit and atmosphere in those discussions. There was contention, but it never really quite got off the ground. There was success on the dairy side that they tried to learn from, but that was back in the Meat Inspection Act and Regulations days. And we're now in the Safe Food for Canadian Act and Regulations. There's a lot more outcome-based and less prescriptivity. And so there's an opportunity, I think, to look at being creative with what's in those federal regulations and the flexibilities that it offers, have a national discussion around an agreed upon federal provincial meat code or meat standard. And then from that, you've got a framework where you could say, okay, we want to somehow fund this so it works across the country in terms of inspection resources. So that's a very big picture kind of solution to it, but I think that's probably the best way to go. And I think we have the will, and we've got a very modern set of regulations. So the will and a bit of resources to thrown into the mix, and I think there's a possibility. At least I'm optimistic. There's an opportunity to move forward. So, and thanks for the question.
Yeah, thanks you, Cameron. Okay, we're a couple minutes past, so I'm going to turn it back to Tyler to wrap us up here.
Thank you very much, Rory, and thank you to all of the panelists for joining and taking part in this discussion today. Please, if you're interested in seeing the report and learning more about what we do at CAPI, visit our website where you can sign up for our mailing list and will be notified for all of the details. You can also find us on YouTube where this recording will be made available. Once again, thank you very much to the panelists and the participants for joining us. Have a great day.